Well, good morning, church. If you are watching this, that means we are not in our normal rhythms of Sunday morning. You are hopefully watching this from the comfort of your own home, and you are staying so warm and so cozy. And we wanted to make sure that you had a chance to be able to gather with your families and with people that you love to be able to have some semblance of church, even though you are snowed in or it's just too dangerous to travel to get here this morning. I wanted to start with a story that happened in my later teenage years of life. Several friends and I, we decided that we wanted to go camping, and so we traveled down to Kentucky to Mammoth National Forest, and we spent there about 3 days really actually camping. Now, this was my first time camping. When I mean other than staying in like a camper or an RV. We stayed in the park for 3 days. We slept in tents and on the ground. We made our own food over the fire, all 3 meals, and we did no shopping other than just to get groceries. And we stayed in the park for those 3 days. It was a lot of fun. It was my first time doing it, and so I had to learn a few different things to be able to navigate what we were going to do. I had never hiked that much, and we went hiking a lot. We would go like in groups. We would take some of the paved out paths to go into the national forest, and then a few of us would from time to time just kind of wander off into the foot trails that had been mapped out by other people walking off the beaten path to be able to explore some of the areas, which was a lot of fun. About our second day in, we realized that one of the people that was a part of our group had decided that she wanted to wander off and go it alone by herself, which would have been okay if she wouldn't have been a foreign exchange student from Germany who barely spoke any English. Her host family was there with us, and at one point the mom said, "Has anyone seen Sabrina?" And we all looked around puzzled and said, "No, why?" And we realized that she decided to wander off the beaten path and away from all of us without telling us or letting anyone know, which, as you can imagine, if you were a parent, especially if you would be hosting another person's child from another country, a little bit of chaos and panic ensued over the next hour as we all tried to find her. After an hour, we all came back to our campsite, and she was sitting there by the fire just waiting for us to return. It was a lot of fun. I wasn't even an adult then, and I can now appreciate very much how much panic must have been in that situation. I want to ask you to consider something this morning. When you think of wilderness, what do you think of? When I think of wilderness, that trip comes to mind because of how I spent my time in the national forest and how we did things and what we talked about while we were there. What comes to mind for you whenever we talk about wilderness? Maybe if you're a hunter, it maybe brings up some images of an early morning in a tree stand. But what do you think of when you think of the word wilderness? We read in Scripture the word wilderness many, many times, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And as always, what you think of when you hear a word means something different to the people in Scripture whenever they hear the word wilderness. In fact, let me read from you Exodus chapter 13, verses 17 through 18. It says this: "When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them along the road to the land of the Philistines, even though it was nearby. For God said, 'The people will change their minds and return to Egypt if they face war.' So he led the people around toward the Red Sea along the road of the wilderness. And the Israelites left the land of Egypt in battle formation." This morning, we wanted to take a look into this idea of the wilderness, and the best way that I know how for us to look at it is first through the lens of the original audience that Scripture was written to. And to help us do that, I have a video that I'd like for you to watch.
In the story of the Exodus, God rescues his people out of slavery to bring them into a new home, a distant garden land full of abundance.
But God didn't take Israel directly there. Instead, God leads Israel the long way through a harsh, dry wilderness.
But why? What's the reason for taking them through the desert?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's explore the biblical theme of the wilderness. different characters end up in the wilderness for different reasons. Sometimes it's a result of their own decisions.
Like when Moses murders an Egyptian and then he has to flee into the wilderness.
But the wilderness can also be the result of other people's bad decisions, like Hagar. She's abused and so escapes into the wilderness. But in both stories, God comes to meet them in the wilderness and provide for their needs.
God meets Hagar at a well and promises a blessing for her family that will last through generations.
And God meets Moses in the wilderness and prepares him to lead his people out of slavery.
Okay, so we're back to our first question. When Moses leads Israel out of slavery, why take them through the wilderness instead of straight to the land of promise?
Well, Israel had not yet learned to trust God with their very lives. And so God led them into the wilderness for a time of preparation.
Preparation?
Well, the wilderness is really harsh, but God went alongside them, providing what they needed, just enough for each day.
Why so little?
Well, God was teaching them to trust that He would show up for them every day. He's training them to listen to His instruction and stay connected to His life.
So the key to surviving in the wilderness is the same key to succeed in the garden.
Yes, the wilderness can be a place to practice being garden people.
Okay, but the intensity of the wilderness was too much for Israel. Most of them didn't listen to God. Some even wanted to go back into slavery.
And they were left behind in the wilderness. So it was the younger generation, those who were raised in and formed by the wilderness. They had become ready to enter into the garden land.
So now that you have a better understanding of what the word wilderness probably meant to the Old Testament audience, let me just help maybe further your understanding a little bit. In the Old Testament language that it was written, the word for wilderness is called midbar. And people understood the word midbar to mean that it was an uncultivated land, this hostile and dangerous place to experience, often coming with many unknowns as they traveled through it. Our pages of scripture here show that God sent them through the wilderness into this new unexplored and unknown land after they had been released from slavery. Now, after suffering in Egypt for the many years they did as slaves, one might think that the freedom found in the wilderness would be a welcome change from what they had been previously experiencing. And in fact, you would think that because God sent them there, they would be excited about what was to come. Let me read for you in Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. After they had started their wilderness journey and had moved on, it records this in Exodus. It says, the entire Israelite community departed from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had left the land of Egypt. The entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Instead, you brought us into this wilderness to make this whole assembly die of hunger. How dramatic for them to say, if only we could please just be back where we had food. Just another reminder of how important food is to people's attitude and their motivations for why they do what they do. You would think that they would be excited about this, but in fact, they grumble whenever they are experiencing these moments in the wilderness. And how these people in this moment see the wilderness time that they're in, well, it's different than how God sees the wilderness time that they're in. Because we read in the earlier chapters of Exodus that God did in fact send them along the longer route into the wilderness, knowing that it would be what they would need in the long run for their faith and for them as a nation, a people of God. So my question for you to consider is, what's your perspective on the wilderness? Now, I'm not talking about the woods or the forest or a place you might go hiking, but I'm asking you to consider, how do you view and what's your perspective on the wilderness times that you go through? And when I say wilderness, let me just remind you that it's an uncultivated land. Potentially times of hostile and dangerous things to experience with a lot of unknowns that you'll have to figure out and navigate. Because while we are talking about a physical wilderness, we're also talking about a spiritual wilderness as well that you could experience. So how do you view the wilderness? Or maybe a better question to ask is, do you know what it's like to experience the wilderness in your own life? Or maybe you've watched someone from afar struggle through moments where they felt like they were going through treacherous and dangerous times for either their physical health or their spiritual health as well. Have you ever experienced situations that seem like in this moment, it could be the end of my faith, or I'm at the end of my rope and I don't know where I'm supposed to go or what I'm supposed to do? Now listen, we get to the wilderness in our lives, both physically and spiritually, in a few ways represented here in Scripture and throughout the pages of Scripture. If you've ever been in a moment where it felt like you didn't know if God was near you or what the resolution to a problem was going to be, we get to the wilderness in a few ways that I just want to talk about for a second. First, we get to those wilderness moments oftentimes because we wander there ourselves. God has something for us and we decide what we want is better, or the plan that we have or the thing that we want to do is either going to be better or easier or less complicated or more simple. And so oftentimes when we experience the wilderness in our faith in following Jesus, it's because we wander there. But also, Scripture records that sometimes we get to the wilderness because God takes us there. That in fact, His leading and direction of us, He sends us to a place in the wilderness because He knows we might not be able to handle another situation. And so He leads us into the wilderness so that we might be able to depend on Him in those moments. And I would say even to protect us from ourselves and some of the decisions that we make. So this frames a great question for each of us to ask in the wilderness and in the moments where we seem spiritually struggling or being challenged. And the question is this: did I wander here myself, or did God lead me here for a reason and a purpose? It's a great question for all of us to be able to ask, and meaningful because it allows for us to have a perspective on why we are where we are spiritually and maybe even physically as well. Because if I've wandered here, then maybe there's some things that I might need to change or course correct. But if God has brought me here in this moment, then what lessons do I need to learn along the way so that I might be able to grow in my faith in following Jesus? You see, regardless of how we get to times of wilderness, this morning I just want for you to consider in all of our lives the idea of midbar, this wilderness that exists. All the times in Scripture that we see this happen to people. And spoiler, it happens a lot. Either because they've wandered there or because God leads them there. All the times that we see the wilderness in Scripture, they also reveal to us powerful and meaningful truths about God that are easy to forget. First of all, we need to remember that God meets us in the wilderness even when we've wandered there on accident. There's never a moment that in our struggles and our challenges and our moments where things seem dangerous and unknown conditions happen, God meets us there in the wilderness, regardless of if we've wandered there because of our own choices and our own actions. And secondly, I think it's helpful to remember that God leads us into and through our wilderness moments so that He can change us and make us into the people He's created us to be. And finally, just remember, in all of the examples we see in the Old Testament and the New Testament, people who went through the wilderness experienced a growth in their faith and their relationship with God. So this morning, if you might find yourself as a family or as a person or maybe a married couple to find yourself in the wilderness and following after Jesus, these moments where it seems like it's unknown conditions and maybe you have no idea where to turn to, I just want for you to be reminded today that in all of those moments in the wilderness, our faith grows because God meets us there and because He leads us there. And because He's always with us, we never walk through the wilderness alone. my friends and I decided we wanted to. I'm gonna stop. Is it a CVS bag?
Yes.
Great diffuser. I think I'd like to have better posture in this chair. That's what I want. Okay.